Okay, everyone, with some blue art today. So good afternoon and welcome to Race Talks and an interdisciplinary virtual colloquium series at Texas A&M University. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you in the call. I'm Dr. Mariana Garriazzo, and today we are welcoming to the series to the acclaimed music theorist Dr. Philip Ewell. It's such a great honor to have him joining us today, and I know that you will have a fantastic time hearing to his wonderful talk. I will be joined today also by Dr. Andrea Imhoff, and she chairs the Climate and Inclusion Committee in the Department of Performance Studies. The Race Talks, before we get into the formal introduction of Dr. Ewell, I would like to tell you a little bit more about Race Talks. This is a project that is possible by a grant of the College of Liberal Arts. The grant is called Advance Climate Together. And it's truly a collaborative project among 6 university units, including African Studies, the Dance Program, Film Studies, Latino and Mexican American Studies, Performance Studies, and Religious Studies. Many thanks to the wonderful staff in Performance Studies that makes all of this run very smoothly, and that is Myra, Darlene, and Kathy. As a complement for the Race Talks, we are launching a student research presentation series titled Lightening Talks, and many of you have heard me talk about them before. The Lightening Talks are very short, 5 minutes to the point video presentation, and we hope that many students in the university would like to bring their unique perspectives into an intersectional campus-wide conversation about race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and faith. So we invite all students, graduates, and undergraduates to participate. The deadline for submission is coming up on April 1st. I'm going to copy and paste here in the chat the information so that you can visit the Lightning Talks. There we go. My chat is a little bit slow today. There it is. And so if you would like to attend more of these talks, please know we are getting to the end of it because we have only 3 more to go for the rest of the semester. They do happen on Thursday at 2 p.m. Fairly almost every Thursday lately, and so we hope to see you there. There's the website in which you can learn more about the talks. Also, I wanted to point out that students can earn Maroon-based points for attending the talks, so you may visit the Maroon student application page and learn more about how to gain prizes and points for attending the talks. To all of us joining us in this talk, I invite you to truly demonstrate the Aggie spirit that sets this community apart. Our core values of excellence, integrity, leadership, and respect inform all of our events and interactions at the Race Talks. All in attendance are expected to demonstrate these core values during our talk today. Quoting Dr. Annie McGowan, Interim Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity, it is the shared responsibility of all of us to embrace and support individuals from a wide range of identities, perspectives, viewpoints, and experiences with full understanding and sensitivity. To promote a safe and inclusive Aggie community, we encourage you to report acts of hatred, discrimination, and bias toward any member of the Aggie community using Stop Hate. The Office for Diversity also provides a toolkit of resources and self-care tips for addressing xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. I'm going to also share with you, this is always happens, this website there. Here we go. Very well. And now some instructions in how we are going to proceed today with the talk. For those of you that have attended talks before, know how this goes. I will ask everyone to remain on mute to ensure the best quality of sound during the talk. At the end of the talk, there will be some time for Q&A. You are welcome to place your questions on the chat all the time throughout the talk, and we will go later on through those questions. At the very end, also there will be a short survey. This survey is anonymous and voluntary, and is open to everyone in attendance to the talks. I will be sharing the link for the survey a little bit later today. And now, without further ado, Professor Inhofe, please take it away.
Well, hello, and thank you very much, Dr. Gariazzo. I appreciate all of the information you gave us. I have been given the privilege of introducing Dr. Philip Ewell today. I had him visit my class yesterday, and the class overran by 30 minutes with conversation that was sparked by this presentation. So I know you're going to enjoy it today. A little information about Dr. Ewell. Dr. Philip Ewell is an associate professor of music theory at Hunter College of the City University of New York, where he serves as Director of Graduate Studies in the Music Department. His specialities include Russian music and music theory, Russian opera, modal theory, and critical race studies. He received the 2019 to 20 Presidential Award for Excellence in Creative Work at Hunter College, and he is the Susan McClary and Robert Walser Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies for 2020 to 21. In August 2020, he received the Graduate Center Award for Excellence in Mentoring, which recognized his ongoing long-term commitment to students at all stages of graduate research. He is also a virtual scholar in residence at the University of the Pacific Conservatory of Music for 2020 to 21. As a result of his ACLS award, he is currently working on a monograph to be published by the Music and Social Justice series at the University of Michigan Press, combining race and feminist studies with music and music theory. In today's lecture, entitled How We Got Here, Where to Next? Examining Assimilationism in American Music Studies, Dr. Ewell will analyze the past as understood through a prism of race and reimagine a new academic study of music, rich and inclusive, which will be rewarding for all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Ewell.
Thank you all so very much for having me here today. It is a great honor to be with you at Texas A&M. So I'm going to share my screen and give a couple of preliminary comments, and then we're off to the races. Here I go. I'm sharing that. I'm sharing this. I'm going to do this. And just a few quick points before I begin. There's a long bibliography at my website. You see on the slide how to get there. So do look at that. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Phil Ewell. Please no unauthorized recording of today's talk. I've timed my talk. It's long. It's 55 minutes or so. So I'm happy to stay a little extra for a Q&A afterward. That's no problem from my side. And finally, I would like to say that I'm going to ask you all to sit with a little bit of discomfort today, because when you look at the history of how we got to where we are in the academic study of music, through the lens of assimilationism, it can be a little uncomfortable, but I have no doubt that everyone down in Texas will rise to the challenge. So thank you all so very much for being here. I begin with an epigraph from ESPN sports journalist Howie Bryant. His recent book, Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field. He writes, "There is, quite plainly, a war against Black people in this country. We will be tolerated if we do not speak, do not challenge, and appear grateful for everything we have. Grateful that our lives are not worse. Our successes are treated as opportunities given and not earned. We do not have the right to address injustices or imbalances, regardless of their historical and statistical obviousness. And when we do, the campaigns to smother, discredit, and ignore our perspectives are immediate and unrelenting. So here's my talk. Thanks for being here once again.
The following program is from NET, the National Educational Television Network.
Debate: James Baldwin versus William Buckley. Subject: has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? This debate was held recently at the Cambridge Union, Cambridge University, England, and was recorded for use by NET.
Well, here we are in the debating hall of the Cambridge Union. Hundreds of undergraduates and myself waiting for what could prove one of the most exciting debates in the whole 150 years of the Union history. I don't think I've ever seen the Union so well attended. There are undergraduates everywhere. They're on the benches, they're on the floor, they're in the galleries, and there are a lot more outside clamoring to get in.
As I recently rewatched this 1965 debate between noted author James Baldwin and conservative icon William F. Buckley, I was struck by how relevant it still is today. The question under debate, has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro, cuts right to the quick of so many questions that have come forward recently in the United States. Baldwin's cri de coeur reminded me of the contemporary cries of Black Lives Matter, while in Buckley's latent white supremacy, it's easy to hear traces of the presidency of Donald Trump. Today, in addressing the academic study of music in the United States, I'd like to speak about the past so that we might chart a path for the future, since only through an in-depth understanding of how we came to view the study of music in the United States can we begin to undo the exclusionist framework of our contemporary music academy. I'll draw on race scholar Ibram Kendi's tripartite history of racist ideas in the United States, namely segregationism, assimilationism, and anti-racism, which I'm sure many of you know. Briefly, a segregationist is one who is expressing the racist idea that a permanently inferior racial group can never be developed and is supporting policy that segregates away that racial group. An assimilationist is one who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior and is supporting cultural or behavioral enrichment programs to develop that racial group, while an anti-racist is one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. Perhaps most important is the simple belief that assimilationism equates with racism in Kendi's paradigm. He says, assimilationist ideas are racist ideas. Assimilationists can position any racial group as the superior standard that another racial group should be measuring themselves against, the benchmark they should be trying to reach. Assimilationists typically position white people as the superior standard. Similarly, as I've written elsewhere, assimilationist ideas are also sexist ideas. If assimilationists position cisgender men as the superior sex, as a superior sex, which has certainly been the case in the academic study of music in the United States. It should therefore go without saying that of the three, only anti-racism is acceptable.
I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, because the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another. Now what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, What this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do, for all our sakes, is simply to accept our history.
What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. The main reason race scholars spend so much time talking about the past is because white power structures in the United States, and I very much include white power structures in American academic music studies here, have not, as Baldwin says, faced the results of what they've done. That is, they have not accepted American history as it's been shaped by race, racism, and white supremacy. When Baldwin speaks of whether a civilization has the right to overtake, subjugate, and destroy another civilization, quite a bold statement to make in England in 1965 when it still held colonial territories, he is clearly articulating the anti-racist belief that all civilizations, and indeed all races, are in fact equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any one race. Baldwin's unflagging anti-racism is impressive, since so many Blacks in 1965 firmly believed in the racist tenets of assimilationism. My favorite example of this is my father, John Ewell, who already wore tweed coats in his teens, wore wire-rimmed glasses long before he needed them, and drove Mercedes he really couldn't afford. In assimilationist fashion, John scoffed at Blacks who were unwilling to assimilate, who wore clothing he considered unorthodox, who rapped over beats he did not consider to be music, or who spoke English he considered non-standard. In fairness to my dad, assimilationism was almost all that was available to mid-20th century Blacks if they wanted to advance their lot in life. As I've mentioned elsewhere, John graduated Morehouse College in 1948 with Martin Luther King, and it need be said that assimilationism dominated among all Black students at prestigious HBCUs like Morehouse in mid-20th century America. After all, W.E.B. Du Bois, who died in 1963, famously loved the music of Wagner and traveled to Germany to study in Berlin and hear Wagner's music at the Bayreuth Festival Theater. My dad's assimilationist coup de grace was marrying my mother, Viola Lavik, an immigrant from Norway who lived through the Nazi occupation of her country during World War II in her hometown of Bergen, and who arrived in the United States on a boat just a few miles from where I speak to you now at Ellis Island in 1959. My mom, who became a green card holder through marriage to my dad in California in late 1960, 7 years before Loving v. Virginia legalized interracial marriage across the country, never became a US citizen, but remained a Norwegian passport holder until her death in 2010. Now, I loved both my folks, and I'm equally proud of my African American and Norwegian heritage. But perhaps the strangest twist of fate here is that while my dad remained assimilationist throughout his whole life, my mom was a staunch anti-racist and anti-sexist. And it was from my white mother that I myself learned what true anti-racism and anti-sexism looked like long before those two terms entered my vocabulary. Returning to the Buckley-Baldwin debate, in stark contrast to Baldwin, William Buckley outlines a rigidly assimilationist argument for the question of the debate.
It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. I urge those of you who have an actual rather than a purely ideologized interest in the problem to read the book Beyond the Melting Pot by Professor Glaser, also co-author of The Lonely Crowd, a prominent Jewish intellectual, who points to the fact that the situation in America where the Negroes are concerned is extremely complex as a result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is the dreadful efforts to perpetuate discrimination by many individual American citizens as a result of their lack of that final and ultimate concern which some people are truly trying to agitate. The other is as a result of the failure of the Negro community itself to make certain exertions which were made by other minority groups during the American experience. If you can stand a statistic not of my own making, let me give you one which Professor Glaser considers as relevant. He says, for instance, in 1900, there were 3,500 Negro doctors in America. In 1960, there were 3,900, an increase in 400. Is this because there were no opportunities, as has been suggested by Mr. Haycock and also by Mr. Baldwin implicitly? No, says Professor Glaser. There are a great many medical schools who are by no means practice discrimination, who are anxious to receive and to train Negro doctors. There are scholarships available to put them through, but in fact that particular energy, which he remarks was so noticeable in the Jewish community and to a certain and lesser extent in the Italian-Irish community, for some reason is not there. We should focus on the necessity to animate this particular energy, but he comes to the conclusion, which strikes me as plausible, that the people who can best do it, who can do it most effectively, are Negroes themselves. Let me conclude.
Watching Buckley's not so thinly veiled assimilationist racism, in which he believes that blacks must be energized and raised up to some kind of white standard so that they might better compete in a white world, is not easy for a 21st century audience. His insistence on treating Buckley, quote unquote, as a white man is a common assimilationist tactic, which seeks to delete race from the equation and make whiteness a de facto standard, one to which non-whites should aspire. This deletion of race is normally referred to as color blindness in the literature. Once official American white supremacy collapsed under its own weight in the 1950s and 60s, color blindness quickly filled the void as the official policy of whiteness after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. But whiteness's panicked insistence that race has nothing to do with a given issue is, to put it simply, a path to nowhere but continued white power. And white power structures know this. George Lipsitz writes, color blindness pretends that racial recognition, rather than racist rule, is the problem to be solved. Color blindness does not do away with color, but rather reinforces whiteness as the unmarked norm against which difference is measured. As Kimberly Crenshaw has repeatedly argued, expecting social institutions to redress racial injuries without referring to race is like having to ask directions to a destination you are not allowed to name. Indeed, the only arguments I've seen against my own race scholarship as it applies to music theory are all variations on this colorblind theme in defense of the status quo. And notably, all such counter arguments, to my knowledge, have come exclusively from people who are both white and male, the two identities that benefit most from the status quo that I challenge. Along the same lines as Lipsitz, Ibram Kendi says, assimilationists believe in the post-racial myth that talking about race constitutes racism, or that if we stop identifying by race, then racism will miraculously go away, which is exactly what William Buckley does when he treats Baldwin as a white man. When Buckley quotes from Beyond the Melting Pot by Nathan Glazer, and co-authored, by the way, with US Senator from New York Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he is giving a textbook definition of assimilationism, namely that in trying to understand the plight of Blacks in the United States, there are two factors at play. One, racial discrimination, and two, a lack of effort by Blacks themselves. And in comparing the plight of Blacks to that of Jews, Italians, and Irish, Buckley notes the lack of energy of Blacks, a sentiment that was so common in the 20th century and, sadly, even now in the 21st. You probably know that Jews, Italians, and Irish were, in the 19th century, not considered to be white in the United States. If you're interested in reading more about whiteness's history and the 4 enlargements of American whiteness, I recommend Nell Irving Painter's The History of White People. Finally, note Buckley's slightly more veiled anti-Semitism as he outsources his racist argument to the, quote, prominent Jewish intellectual, close quote, Nathan Glazer. Significantly, Glazer later recanted the assimilationist position he had taken in Beyond the Melting Pot in a new book called We Are All Multiculturalists Now. In a New York Times interview from 1998, Glazer conceded, the American mind has placed Blacks in a different category. If you're wondering, James Baldwin won that debate in a landslide, 554 to 164 votes. But that certainly did not spell the end of assimilationism, as you all know. William F. Buckley is probably best known for starting one of the most influential conservative magazines in America, the National Review, in 1955. Imagine my surprise when I opened my computer this past August to see my name in none other than the National Review. William Buckley is turning in his grave. Now, to be clear, I'm perfectly okay to have Buckley turn in his grave by having my race scholarship appear in the National Review, but I should mention here the controversy that involved this scholarship, which I'm certain many of you have heard about. More important, I wish to relate this controversy to my topic today, namely the assimilationist racism and sexism that account for how we got to where we are in the academic study of music today, where non-white and non-male voices are marginalized. It began with a talk entitled Music Theory's White Racial Frame that I gave in November 2019. I borrowed the concept of the white racial frame from Texas A&M Distinguished Professor of Sociology, Joe Fagan, whose book by the same title is now in its 3rd edition. Joe, I don't know if you're listening, but you are a hero of mine. Thank you for everything you have done in the cause of racial justice in the United States of America. I say I don't know if he's here because I think Joe has heard this talk before. I have given it a few times. So if you're there, Joe, hi. Everybody should bow down to Joe. He's a wonderful scholar and a wonderful person. In fact, it was not just the National Review that reported on the controversy, but also National Public Radio, the Dallas Observer, Inside Higher Education, The Conversation, Adam Neely's popular YouTube channel, The New Yorker, an interview on NTV, one of Russia's leading television networks, and the New York Times. Perhaps most striking was to see my name in Fox News. Never to miss a beat, Fox slightly adjusted the title of my talk changing white racial frame to white radical frame. Oh, Fox News, so silly. Not so subtle. I think they've since corrected it to white racial frame, but they didn't note the correction of the original on the bottom, which you are supposed to do if you are a, legitimate news source. So why the controversy? Here are the facts. On November 9th, 2019, I gave a 20-minute talk, Music Theory's White Racial Frame, at the annual conference of the Society for Music Theory in Columbus, Ohio. As an example of our white frame, I challenged the notion that the well-known racism of Heinrich Schenker could be separated from his music theories and simply be ignored, as most everyone has said beforehand. Schenker, an extremely important figure to American music theory, was a German nationalist who believed that Germans and whites generally were more capable than others of producing works of genius like that of Mozart, Schubert, or Beethoven. Most important, Schenker was insistent that his views on race and his views on music be taken together and not separated in his unified view of the world. Thus, in reconnecting Schenker's racist hierarchies of peoples with his musical hierarchies of notes, I was, in fact, honoring Schenker's wishes. I gave clear examples of how we have whitewashed Schenker's repulsive white supremacist beliefs in order to promote his music analytical ideas and shield his legacy from unwanted criticism. This 2-year project culminated in a roughly 18,000 word article, Music Theory in the White Racial Frame, that appeared in Music Theory Online in June 2020 and currently has over 73,000 visits. I also published a related 6-part blog confronting racism and sexism in American music theory in March, April of last year, and that blog currently has over 101,000 views. Certain faculty at the University of North Texas, which houses the Journal of Schenkerian Studies, decided to launch a response issue to my talk. I was not personally invited to participate in the ensuing symposium. Such participation is standard, and they included an anonymous response to my talk in the issue, which is not standard. Several of the 15 responses included clear anti-Black and assimilationist racist tropes, precisely the kind of tropes that were, in fact, part of my research. They also included many ad hominem attacks on me. Once the racist tropes came to light, social media took over, hashtag Schenkergate began trending, and the rest is history. Perhaps the strangest thing about this symposium, whose contents of roughly 90 pages are shown here, was the simple fact that they were responding to a 20-minute talk, which only became possible when the Society began live streaming and recording sessions a couple of years ago. If anyone from the journal had contacted me, I would have suggested that they wait for the article to come out, since they were getting quite an incomplete picture from my talk, only about 9 minutes of which focused on Heinrich Schenker. At very least, I could have sent them a transcript of my talk, which would have saved them the trouble of watching me on Vimeo multiple times or having to transcribe the talk themselves. In fact, this is the only published response to a 20-minute talk that I've ever heard of. In the introduction to the symposium, the editors expressed their pride in the issue, extolling the exchange of ideas and informed debate. To which I've publicly responded in several interviews that it's kind of hard to have an actual debate when one of the two sides is not invited. In other words, I shouldn't have to request an invitation to a party thrown in my honor. I'll share some excerpts from this symposium here, since they provide an excellent roadmap in understanding the white male assimilationism that underpins the academic study of music in the United States. David Beach wrote, "My suggestion to Philip Ewell is that he stop complaining about us white guys and publish some sophisticated analytical graphs of works by Black composers. I, for one, would welcome into the analytical canon works by both Black and women composers." Beach has since publicly apologized for his white guys comment, and I accept his apology. But I'd like to point out that he clearly believes that in order for Blacks and women to enter the musical canon, they must assimilate and have the stamp of approval of his white male methodology, namely Schenkerian analytical graphs. Also, I'd point out how he feels he has the position to quote unquote welcome women and Blacks into the canon. This is known as white entitlement and male entitlement. And it is precisely these notions of entitlement that I challenge with my race and feminist work in music theory. Side note here, to read more about male entitlement and the harm it causes women, I recommend Kate Mann's new book entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. Of course, white privilege and white entitlement hurt non-whites in similar and intersectional fashion. Jack Boss wrote, "Timothy Jackson has already shown that Schenker's attitude toward Black musicians was more nuanced than what Ewell asserts, changing over time as Schenker himself matured. So my response will focus instead on the possibility, perhaps even the necessity during our present time, of using the premises of Schenkerian analysis to lead to the opposite conclusion, that Black musicians did indeed produce works of genius, works which ornamented their structures in new and fascinating ways, and are worthy of our study." Boss, too, has issued an apology to me, which I accept. But to Boss, it seems to come as something of a surprise almost, that blacks too could produce works of genius. But the main point here is, yet again, such genius is only conferred by the white male methodology that is Schenkerian analysis, the final determinant of genius in this white male assimilationist framework. The simple notion of genius is problematic itself from a critical race perspective. New Yorker music critic Alex Ross says, the danger of the word genius is that it implies an almost biological category, an innately superior being, a superhero. It is probably no accident that the category of genius, an obsession of the 19th century, coincided with the emergence of the pseudoscience of race, which held that certain peoples were genetically fitter than others. There can be no question that the entire concept of genius, which Boss uses so casually here, is closely linked to the idea of both whiteness and maleness in the academic study of music, a point that should always be made when one brings up genius. In fact, this was Heinrich Schenker's point exactly, that white German men were genetically fitter than others to produce works of genius. The term Schenker used for this German genetic superiority was der Menschenhumus, which Ian Bent has translated as human propagating soil. Charles Burckhardt says in a response that is all of one paragraph in length, are we therefore to pauperize ourselves, to throw out Schenker's better ideas, the ones that have vastly enriched the field of music theory? If not, what is the point in dwelling on Schenker's faults at such length? Why this animus? Now, if you watch my talk or read my long article, I don't think you'll find much animus in there, but I'll let you decide. Yet with respect to Burckhardt's question of why we should dwell on Schenker's faults, the answer is simple. Because I, for instance, am one of only 2 Black associate professors in the entire 1,200-member Society for Music Theory, which comes, in part, as the result of not examining Schenker's legacy. Burckhardt's charge of animus is part and parcel of the blame the victim mentality when whiteness combines with maleness in American history, which is exactly the one expressed by William F. Buckley in his debate with James Baldwin, when Buckley blamed blacks for their unfortunate plight. Timothy Jackson wrote, of course, I understand full well that you will only attack Schenker as a pretext to introduce his main argument, that liberalism is a racist conspiracy to deny rights to quote unquote people of color. Ewell is uninterested in bringing blacks up to standard so they can compete. Strange how Jackson uses scare quotes for people of color as if that's not really a thing. But most disturbing, of course, is his belief that blacks must be brought up to standard in order to compete, which is precisely the racist sentiment that William F. Buckley expressed in 1965. I have to be honest, a clearer instance of anti-Black assimilationist racism I could not have scripted myself. It seems Jack Boss agrees with Jackson since he endorses Jackson's essay in his quotation above. In another comment, Jackson says, as for Black composers, they have had to overcome unbelievable prejudice and hardships, yet there have been many talented and technically competent Black composers in the past 100 years. We can certainly listen to their music with pleasure, even if they are not supreme geniuses on the level of the very greatest classical composers. One of the cruelest things in Ewell's agenda is his concomitant dismissal of the works of Black classical composers as irrelevant. They are the people who suffer the most from ideologues. That is racism. I'll let this quotation stand without any further direct commentary from me. I'll let the listener draw their own conclusions. I'll simply say here that at this point, I imagine William F. Buckley is smiling from ear to ear in his grave. Another response author, Alan Cadwallader, was so incensed by my 9-minute discussion of Schenker that he sent a personal email, which he followed up with an apology a few hours later. In his apology, which I accept, Cadwallader wrote, "My apologies, it's been a tough time." He was apologizing for this email, which he sent some 8 hours prior. First, let me say what an idiot I think you are. You obviously can't do theory and analysis, so you make a career out of putting Blacks against whites. He obviously means pitting blacks against whites. I would put a little seek in square brackets after pudding, but I digress. Your only hope of making a name is to right some injustice. Your ilk is if you can't do, then find some social injustice to talk about. Let's meet in the forum of your choice. Pick your piece and let's have an analysis symposium. Talk to me about counterpoint, harmony, linear analysis. You are inept at all of these. Signed, Alan Cadwallader. Talk about animus. While Cadwallader's invective is certainly unseemly, my larger point lies in his firm belief that only through the imprimatur of his white male analytical methods, through counterpoint, harmony, and linear analysis, can music be worthy of our consideration in the first place. I'd also like to point out his lack of a salutation to me in either email. That is his inability to say my name. The response to this whole affair in support of me and in condemnation of the journal's symposium and its main authors was overwhelming. I heard from hundreds of people from all over the globe who wrote such notes of support. Officially, Yale University, my alma mater, wrote that they reject and condemn the racist and personal attacks on Professor Ewell. Notably, Yale's statement pointed out how there were no people of color and only one woman among the respondents, and how the symposium only proved the point I made in my article that music theory's white frame seeks to maintain the status quo generally and shield Schenker from unwanted criticism specifically. The Society for Music Theory condemned the, quote, anti-black statements and ad hominem attacks on Philip Ewell, close quote. The University of Toronto adopted similar language and added, quote, we acknowledge that North American music theory urgently needs to reckon with its racist, anti-black, white supremacist roots in order to evolve and grow, close quote. The Society for Music Theory, the Music Theory Society of New York State made a similar statement, and an open letter on anti-racist action, ultimately signed by more than 900 people, was drafted and addressed to the Society for Music Theory. The real irony here is that, unwittingly, this journal issue and its most aggressive authors have done more to harm Schenker and his legacy than anything I have, or anything I intended. To the contrary, I've expressed my hope that Schenkerian analysis survives in the 21st century. If they had asked or waited for my article to come out, they would have learned this simple fact. Here's how I put it toward the end of that article. I have offered many challenges to our music theory community, but I do so only in the spirit of scholarly inquisition and betterment for the field. If music theory is to survive in the 21st century, as I hope it does, we have much soul searching to do with respect to race. If Schenkerian theory is to survive in the 21st century, as I hope it does, we must confront the uncomfortable realities, not just of Schenker himself, but more important, of the legacy of how we have engaged with his ideas and what that means with respect to race in American music theory. Thus, contrary to what social media trolls or right-wing news outlets have strained to say about my work, I've never suggested that we should cancel Schenker or, for that matter, cancel Beethoven or stop playing and teaching music of the Western canon. I most certainly do, however, suggest that we challenge the many ways in which white male structures have excluded non-white and non-male voices from the conversation. Now, it's not without trepidation that I mention colleagues in a negative light. Some of you may know the 5 journal authors I mentioned and be thinking to yourselves how you don't know them to be racist in any way. I'm certainly not calling any one of them a racist here. But it's important to consider just how much power such senior white male colleagues wield and how often we are inclined and even expected to excuse their bad behavior. Kate Mann calls this inclination empathy, which is the inappropriate and disproportionate sympathy powerful men often enjoy in cases of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, homicide, and other misogynistic behavior. In Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, Mann further notes that empathy happens when men are accused of other forms of discrimination, such as racist behavior. I therefore respectfully ask the listener to check any empathetic impulses if and when they arise. The amount of power that such senior white male faculty have and have had is enormous. And most important, they have all been involved, as such senior faculty always are, in formulating the music curricula at their respective institutions and setting the policies. by which music majors, undergraduate and graduate, must abide. We make a grave mistake if we think that the extreme positions represented by several authors in volume 12 of the Journal of Schenkerian Studies are exceptional to or on the fringe of American music theory. What we must now understand is that virtually every music program in the United States was founded on the very same white male assimilationist models that were so clearly articulated in this journal issue. Indeed, perhaps the most unfortunate aspect of this entire affair is how it reduced my arguments to one figure, Heinrich Schenker, when in fact, my arguments extend far beyond this one person and his legacy. In this sense, Schenker has become a straw man in order to deflect from my extended arguments. Since defending Schenker from unwanted criticism is something that music theory's white racial frame has done so skillfully now for many decades. To bring it back to the tripartite division of racist ideas in American history, it's important to note what races fit in where. Of course, any race can fit into any one of the three circles here. Yes, there were BIPOC who believed in segregationism and even white supremacy, though their numbers are far lower than the American history we've officially been taught in our schools. More important, there are countless significant white anti-racist figures and scholars, especially in the late 20th and 21st centuries. Here's a list of some of my favorites. My mother was not an author, she was a registered nurse, but she would certainly fall into this category of significant white anti-racist figures. However, in the history of racist ideas in the United States, Black persons had what Kendi, using language from W.E.B. Du Bois, calls a dual consciousness between assimilationist and anti-racist ideas. Kendi says, the dual within Black consciousness usually seems to be between anti-racist and assimilationist ideas. I'll remind the listener that my African-American father was stuck in the assimilationist circle, though he didn't even realize it himself. However, with respect to white people, Kendi says that historically, white people have their own dueling consciousness between the segregationist and the assimilationist, the slave trader and the missionary, the pro-slavery exploiter and the anti-slavery civilizer, the eugenicist and the melting potter, the mass incarcerator and the mass developer, the Blue Lives Matter and the All Lives Matter, the not racist nationalist and the not racist American. Assimilationist ideas and segregationist ideas are the two types of racist ideas, the dual within racist thought. White assimilationist ideas challenge segregationist ideas that claim people of color are incapable of development, incapable of reaching the superior standard, incapable of becoming white and therefore fully human. Assimilationists believe that people of color can in fact be developed, become fully human, just like white people. The historical duel of racist ideas in America that was so common among white people in our history has yet to be fully understood in the United States. The African people brought to America in chains, or the indigenous people who were already here when Europeans began arriving in significant numbers in the 16th and 17th centuries, were not incapable of being civilized, nor were they capable of rising to the level of whites. The simple fact is that there was never anything wrong with Africans or Native Americans to begin with. The mythology that there was is perhaps the most durable and heart-wrenching legacy of racism that remains for all of us to unravel in the United States. Indeed, certain authors in the Journal of Schenkerian Studies Symposium proved that this particular mythology of racial inferiority is still very much alive and well in American music studies. I can now present my history of how we teach academic music in the United States. The academic study of music in the United States started here with segregationism in the late 19th century. When Jim Crow racism became untenable in the mid-20th century, it migrated here to assimilationism, and here it remains in 2021. Though we can see racial disparities, we have not yet begun to grapple with the assimilationist racist history of how we have taught music in our conservatories and schools of music in the United States. We cannot understand what anti-racism in academic music will look like in the future until we understand what racism in academic music looked like in the past. Before I turn to where we go next, I must re-emphasize that the true anti-racist work to be done lies in unearthing past racist activities in the field. If someone asks me, what can we do to make things better now, today? My first answer is always research the past in depth and come to a better understanding of how our musical institutions were created in order to benefit white cisgender men while disadvantaging all others. This research is demanding and can be exhausting, but this is where the best solutions actually reside. And the change that this work can affect will be rewarding and emancipating for everyone. So, where to next? There are many new initiatives that try to include people outside of classical music's historic whiteness and maleness, but many sources still need to be written. One reason that there are no music theory textbooks, for example, that have truly decentered the Western canon is that we have only recently begun to understand just how deeply embedded that canon is in whiteness and maleness, and how closely whiteness and maleness are tied to power, both in the United States and in the American Music Academy. Critical race theory, which started at Harvard Law School in the 1980s, often asks the simple question, what would the law look like if Bipoc had written it? This would be a great question for us music educators to ask as well. Clearly, it would look quite different from what it looks like currently across the country. So here are some tips to think about as we teach and play music this academic year. Never whitewash the horribleness of anyone whose music you're looking at, and do your research to know the biography of the artist in question. I'm often asked about how we should deal with the beautiful artistry of what are sometimes called in the literature monstrous men, or as I like to call them, men. Being open about your own self-reflection about these problematic figures will go a long way in helping students and helping yourselves. By the way, two excellent entry points into this conversation are Gaslight of the Gods, Why I Still Play Michael Jackson and R. Kelly for My Students by Will Cheng, and Post-Colonialism on the Make, the music of John Mellencamp, David Bowie, and John Zorn by Elie Hassama. 2, begin to see beyond whiteness and maleness. I recently took place in a Decolonizing the Classroom discussion, and we spoke of some of the problematic figures in music. We began with Wagner, of course, and then we moved on to George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, and before you knew it, we were talking about Tom Cruise and Mel Gibson, among other problematic figures. Finally, I pointed out how all of the 8 or so people mentioned were white men. Defaulting to white men is something we do so naturally in the United States, we never even question it, and we must begin to question it in a most fundamental way. 3, immerse yourselves in anti-racist and anti-sexist literature. Doing this work has advantages you might not think about right away, like opening up important classroom conversations about a path forward. Begin the discussion of pitch, rhythm, meter, and scale with non-white approaches from, say, Asia, Africa, or the Middle East. This helps to debunk the white-framed mythology that musical civilization and musical whiteness began solely with the ideas of ancient Greeks, which they obviously did not. 5, when introducing Western music theory, do so from the angle of composers who would not have identified as both white and male. There were obviously many such composers throughout Western history, and scholars are now working with them. Garrett Schumann and his apex contemporary performance work often with BIPOC and women composers in the Western classical tradition, going back to Black Renaissance composer Vicente Lusitano. The Institute for Composer Diversity is probably the largest repository of works by marginalized composers. Mark Hannaford, Michel Duguay, and Toro Momi put together a great bibliography, Engaged Music Theory, which, quote, encourages music scholars to engage directly with issues of cultural politics. Project Spectrum is another useful resource in decentering music's whiteness and maleness. Finally, the Composers of Color Resource Project and Music by Black Composers also highlight this rich repertoire that has until now been so very underrepresented. Finally, contextualize Western pieces with other pieces. One of the best presentations on bowed string instruments I've ever seen was given by New York violinist Sky Steele in November 2018, which you can also find now on YouTube. He contextualized these instruments going back some 2,000 years and showed how such string instruments started in Asia and Africa and then migrated both west and north to Europe. He had examples of the physical instruments themselves from many countries of the globe, and he played tunes on these instruments, sometimes with a percussionist, to give examples of the music. Then, about 3/4 of the way through the presentation, he played a gavotte from one of the three partitas for solo violin by Johann Sebastian Bach. It was a perfect way to show that Bach, who also wrote significant bowed string instrument music in human history, was one of many of our planet's notable composers. I think this type of contextualization is probably the best way to introduce Western art forms to our students. More generally, it's important to question why we do what we do on our voices and instruments. I draw a parallel here to race by using Kate Mann's distinction between sexism and misogyny. She writes, misogyny should be understood primarily as the law enforcement branch of a patriarchal order, which has the overall function of policing and enforcing its governing norms and expectations, while sexism should be understood primarily as the justificatory branch of a patriarchal order, which consists in ideology that has the overall function of rationalizing and justifying patriarchal social relations. My parallel to race is, sexism is like racism, patriarchy is like white supremacy, while misogyny is like anti-Blackness, a concept race scholars often cite in the United States. So what do we do in music that historically, what things do we do in music that were historically meant to police and enforce both whiteness and maleness? Two of my favorite examples are, one, German language requirements, usually in graduate school, and two, the study of figured bass, shown here for the non-musicians listening in a bass line with Arabic numerals underneath, a common shorthand for writing keyboard or lute accompaniment in the Renaissance and Baroque eras. Of course, it should be obvious to everyone that one does not need to know German in order to do music theory. Along the same lines, knowledge of figured bass, though helpful if one wishes to learn 18th century European keyboard practice, is also quite unnecessary. Requiring German and requiring knowledge of figured bass are two significant ways in which our white male frame polices and enforces both whiteness and maleness, if for no other reason, because 100% of the German texts and figured bass compositions that we are supposed to engage with were, in fact, written by white cisgender men. The gold standard for policing and enforcing whiteness and maleness in academic music in the United States is the so-called blind peer review process at major journals and conferences. Setting aside the ableist language for the moment, it could be better called anonymous peer review, for example. This process, which is rarely anonymous on the part of both author and reviewer, allows music's white male frame to weed out work that challenges its authority, and to do so under cover of darkness without accountability. This is one reason why music theory's white male frame has been so up in arms about my 6-part blog, Confronting Racism and Sexism in American Music Theory, since I simply bypassed the anonymous peer review process, which exists in very large part to uphold whiteness and maleness as authoritative in the field.
What stands out to me is just watching the Republican convention, and they're spewing this fear, right? Like, all you hear is Donald Trump and all of them talking about fear. We're the ones getting killed. We're the ones getting shot. We're the ones that we're denied to live in certain communities. We've been hung, we've been shot, and all you do is keep hearing about fear. It's amazing to me why we keep loving this country and this country does not love us back.
It's amazing to me why we keep loving this country, and this country does not love us back. Doc Rivers, holding back tears, gave this emotional statement on August 26, 2020. In 1965, James Baldwin said the same thing. Quote, "It comes as a great shock to discover that the flag to which you've pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to you," unquote. On the one hand, we've come so very far in the United States with respect to racial equality in the last 55 years, yet on the other, we've come nowhere at all. While the reaction to my race and feminist scholarship as it applies to music study has been overwhelmingly positive, I also receive mean-spirited commentary. Sometimes it's harmless, like this unsolicited Facebook direct message in which the author says, "I actually read about your opinion on European music in an Austrian newspaper. I never read such nonsense before in my life. You're obviously completely incompetent. Please stay with your opinion in the USA. An entire continent is laughing at you." Signed, Konstantin Staus-Rausch. My only reaction to this is, hang on, you mean to tell me they're actually writing about my work in Austrian mass media? That's awesome. All too often, however, the negative commentary takes a dark turn. For exposing some of the more insidious elements of whiteness and maleness in American music theory, I have been called inept and incompetent. I've been called a racist, an idiot, a charlatan, a moron, a communist, a nitwit, an anti-Semite, a monkey, a bigot, and yes, I have been called a nigger. Sometimes such vile commentary appears anonymously, sometimes it does not. And sometimes, astonishingly, such commentary appears in a purportedly peer-reviewed academic music journal. Also extremely significant, all such nasty commentary, as far as I can discern, is exclusively from people who are both white and male. I've been called all of these horrible things by white men, and I've been threatened by them as well. I just recently received a death threat. Simply because I, a Black African-American man, have had the temerity to stare music theory's structural and institutional whiteness and maleness in the face and challenge its authority publicly and explicitly. And because I then have had the common sense to suggest that we do something about it. I can think of no better evidence than this foul language from these detractors to underscore just how urgently we must begin to dismantle the structural whiteness and maleness, not just of American music theory, which has been the main focus of my work, but how we teach music to our students in the 21st century. I have three simple words for such detractors. Enough is enough. I am undeterred and unafraid as I press my case for structural and institutional change in the academic study of music in the United States. Discussions about race are hard, but there is no good reason to not have those discussions. More to the point, discussions about how whiteness and maleness have worked in tandem to create musical policies that benefit themselves while disadvantaging non-whiteness and non-maleness are even harder, yet we need them now more than ever. To end in a more positive light, I'd like to highlight just how many notes of support and solidarity I've received over the past year or so. Hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds from all over the planet. I'm most touched by comments from students, like a Puerto Rican doctoral music student, male, who wrote, "As a composer of color, I've experienced quite a brutal amount of racism in classical music. At first, that didn't permeate my academic thinking work until I read your music theory and the white racial frame. It opened my eyes and it gave words to so many things and experiences I held inside as just my fault or the typical, that's how the system works." Or this white American doctoral female student who writes, "I just wanted to write you a quick note to say I've been reading your weekly posts with great enthusiasm. You're bringing up issues that are really important to so many younger scholars like myself, and I am grateful that you are taking the spotlight on this, even though I can only imagine that's not easy." It is for students like these that I do this work, students who have been marginalized or shut out of the academic study of music because of its exclusionist nature. Students who now express to me that maybe, just maybe, there is a place for them in our American Music Academy. But where does this leave white men? Here's a note to me from a young white male scholar, along with my response. I just wanted to say I appreciate all the thought and research you have put into your work on dismantling white supremacy in music theory and history. I'm an aspiring ethnomusicologist, and the deeper I get into this field, the more I'm smacked on my head with my own personal biases I have developed in my learning of culture and music. Your work has helped me, a white male, understand my privilege in this society a bit better, and hopefully I can use this privilege to step aside, to let others have the chance to stand center stage. In my response, I of course thanked this young scholar for his kind words, and then I added, with respect to stepping aside, don't go too far off the stage. One of the crucial aspects of my work is underscoring just how important it is for white men to be part of the restructuring of music studies in the States. Sure, be mindful of privilege and listen respectfully, but when you have something to say, say it and be heard. We're all in this together, after all. Indeed, we are all in this together. A simple point I cannot stress enough. White men are a crucial part of the structural realignment now going on in music studies, not just here in the States, but in many places where white male structures have dominated. Based on the hundreds of such comments I've received from young scholars, Black, white, and all other races, I now have great hope that the future of the academic study of music in the United States will become much more inclusive sooner rather than later. Strike while the iron's hot, I like to say. Well, the iron has never been hotter. The future, never brighter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ewell.
Thank you.
We have only a short time, and I'm sure we all have a great many questions. If you have a question, please write it into the chat and I'll read it out for you. And we'll just deal with as many of them as we can in the time we have remaining. So there's one here already to start, and this is from Apsara, who was in your lecture yesterday to my class. How does one have a conversation about anti-racism with an individual who becomes defensive and argues in support of color blindness, ignoring race as part of our experiences?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It's difficult. There's no question about it. Like I say, conversations about race are difficult. One needs to gauge whether the person is honestly willing to have an honest conversation about it or not. Of course, there's a spectrum of people out there who have all kinds of ideas about race. If the person is simply going to deflect and never going to acknowledge that race is part of the picture, if the person is going to insist that the only solution is to, quote unquote, be colorblind, which no significant race scholar would ever say, then my advice is probably not to waste time. You could imagine that there are people out there who are just not going to come on board, and that's okay. I mean, it's a complicated world. So that's a simple thing. However, I have found that there are many people who might want to rely on color blindness. Like I said, that was my father, and he was Black, died in 2007. So, you know, if there are people who have wanted to rely on color blindness, because that's of course been put out there as the primary belief that if we don't talk, that the only reason race is a problem is by talking about it, which, you know, again, no race scholar would ever say that. Then you can keep talking about historical points where, in fact, race made a very big difference. Of course, knowing the history, as I think I do now, I mean, I feel I've become a bit of an American historian in doing all of this race scholarship. I really am but a humble cellist. You know, if you were to hold my feet to the fire, just give me a bow and I'll just play some music, right? You know, knowing the history and these kind of irrefutable points, places whereby you can't deny that these things are real. I'll end by pointing out something I said yesterday kind of off the cuff, I said in the class yesterday, imagine an alien comes down to the States and looks at our country and says, well, hang on, you have a judicial system and a Supreme Court that's the final law of the land. And in the history of the Supreme Court of your country, you've had, I don't know, let's say probably 99% white judges and 98.8% male, cisgender male judges, right? Cisgender men. And those are just numbers, right? But you can't refute them. And you can't go back in history and rewrite the books and say, no, there are Black people who were Supreme Court justices. There weren't. Thurgood Marshall was the first, right? And the first woman was Sandra Day O'Connor, I think. So the aliens would look at each other, they'd be like, well, hang on. These folks are ruling for all of these people, some of whom are white cisgender men, but many of whom are not. White cisgender men have always been a minority, always been a minority of the country. The white majority peaked at about 80%, I think, in the United States, and now it's between 60 and 63%, depending on how you define white. Of course, the definitions of white always change. They've always changed, and they still will. But I think that that's just a very basic way of saying to people, that matters. You can't deny that the Supreme Court judicial system has been run by white cisgender men. That's just a fact. And when you look at just basic facts like that, it can't be that they are fair in all of their wisdom. They have to have biases. In other words, they're humans, the way we all are. I hope I answered that question. I did it the best job I could. It's a very difficult one.
And I think we have time for one more. So this one comes to us from my colleague in the Department of Performance Studies, Leo Cardoso. And he says, in which ways do you think the notion of genius, which has been the basis of much wham historiography, challenges an anti-racist project in music history? Do you think orchestras around the country are in general open to that shift?
The concept of genius is definitely more detrimental than it is helpful, generally speaking. That's not exactly what the questioner was asking. Our orchestras, I'll do the second part first and then the first part. Are symphony orchestras willing to acknowledge this shift? The short answer is no. The symphony orchestras, which are deeply, deeply rooted in our white male patriarchy in this country, or our white patriarchy in the United States. And this is just borne out, again, by the numbers. If you look at the numbers of people who play in these symphony orchestras, they're almost all white and still majority male. So I'll just set that aside, and now I'll talk about just genius a little bit to wrap up. The way that people use genius, like Alex Ross said in the 19th century, was to begin to prove culturally and scientifically that white people were superior. This was a big project that really only happened within the last 200 years. This was creating the mythology of Western civilization that started with the ancient Greeks. If you're interested in a source, I would cite Kwame Appiah, a very interesting British historian whose father was Ghanaian and his Black Ghanaian from Africa, his mother's English, who writes about the falsehoods of Western Civ. In other words, Western Civ was a human construct that really is about 150 to 200 years old. Well, along with all of the mythologies that were created in the 19th century, both scientific, the pseudoscience of race, measuring people's brains to prove that white people had bigger brains and all of that, and they're more beautiful. Pseudoscience, I mean, that's just not true. And then, of course, the cultural studies. Music, artwork painted by white people was better and more brilliant and had more perspective in the paint strokes and all that. And the sculptures were better carved, and the music compositions were better constructed, right? That's what we have all been taught. The idea of genius is also a human construct, really largely of the 19th century. And it is something we simply have to let go of, because if in fact you believe that there are geniuses out there as they were constructed from 19th century cloth, then you have a really hard time letting go of some of the people associated with that genius. I'll simply say here to end that with remarkable consistency, the geniuses that we have been told are geniuses were in fact white, cisgender men. Picasso, Van Gogh, Monet, Auguste Rodin, Modigliani, I'm just choosing painters, sculptors, Ernst Hemingway, Alexander Pushkin, who actually had a great grandfather from Africa, by the way, William Shakespeare, Stravinsky, Bach, Beethoven, just choose your art. And then, philosophy is one of my favorites, because I'm sure you know that philosophy means the love of wisdom, right? Phil Soph, the love of wisdom. Well, you study philosophy in the United States and you study Kant, Immanuel Kant, Heidegger, Schopenhauer, or Jean-Paul Sartre. And at the end of it all, you get a PhD and you realize, oh my gosh, everybody I studied was a white cisgender man. And I have a PhD now. In other words, only white cisgender men loved wisdom. I think I'll leave it at that, because that's just not true. Let's to state the obvious. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. The questions keep coming, Dr. Ewell. How are we on time at your end? Can we do another one?
I could go to 4:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
3:30 our time, for those that are wondering. We're doing the New York/Texas time.
I know I'm this arrogant New Yorker who's just like, everything is New York time. I gave a talk in South Africa last week. It's New York time. I don't care what time it is in South Africa. Don't bother me. It's horrible, I know. But whatever. I'm here in New York City. So.
So the next one comes to us from Kelsey. How do you suggest the introduction of music composed by Bipoc composers in the classroom? Traditionally, in my orchestra classes, I've had the opportunity to play great works by Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky, etc., and only a few by Bipoc composers, for instance, Grant Still. And I have enjoyed its elements like the knocking of the wood on the instrument and so on. I think it would be great to introduce more of these pieces to the classroom. Do you think open-mindedness and research into these pieces is the key to this? P.S. Also, what a great day to be a cellist.
Oh, cello power. Yeah. I'm going to drop into the chat a tweet that I sent a couple of weeks ago. I pinned it also for the time being. I'm not huge social media person, but here is something I did write. Wait a minute, that was a direct thing. Let me do this again to everyone. Do I have, there it is, everyone. Did that go? Yeah, so I'll read it now. Musicians, adding composers who did not identify as white cis men equals diversity, equity, inclusivity, DEI. Exposing how and why such men created structures and institutions and mythologies to benefit themselves while disadvantaging all others is anti-racism and anti-sexism. Both are useful, the latter harder and more impactful. So you can tell that my talk today is definitely in the realm of anti-racism. I'm exposing how some of these things have played out so that white cisgender men have the upper hand, and that it was quite intentional the way that the structures were created in institutions, like having a German language exam, which is one way to police and enforce whiteness and maleness. Because all the texts were written by white men, like I said. So adding the people who are who would have identified or who do identify as BIPOC is excellent. And I do put this very clearly into the realm of DEI, but it's a lot easier, right? Why? Because it's not threatening. It's not threatening to white male power structures of music. Yes, let's play William Grant Still. Florence Price is having a lot of airtime these days. Great, she was a great composer, a Black woman, right? So that will only go so far, because it will leave completely in place the false notion that the music of the white Western canon is superior. It doesn't question that. Brahms, his symphonies are still superior, and they will be considered as such until we have a conversation about genius, like the questioner asked. Thank you for that question, because that's going to expose some of the unpleasantness of what we do. The conversations about genius, the conversations about superiority, the historical conversations about white supremacy. In the 19th century, would anybody dispute my simple statement that would say we lived in a white supremacist country in the 19th century? That's a historical fact. I mean, people would probably try and deflect and say, no, no, blah, whatever. But, you know, we can more or less have a group nod that that's the case. But in terms of putting BIPOC composers onto a program, there has to be, yes, the addition. There's a lot of work being done. I myself have done some work. I'll have a piece come out on a blog. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll announce it probably later tonight, where I list 28 composers and music theorists who would have been, who might have been interesting to music theory. But until we have, you know, really difficult adult conversations about the structures and institutions of how we got to where we are, and to the Metropolitan Opera. I'm pointing over here because it's right across Central Park from where I am in my office right now. I could walk to the Met in 40 minutes. 183, it was 1883, so 138 years, not one opera by an African American composer. The first mythology that white men will tell us, oh, there were none written. That's always been a lie. It's never true. There were always African American composers. The first one, I think, was probably John Thomas Douglas's 3-act Virginia's Ball, which he wrote in and premiered at the Stuyvesant Institute right down there, which is no longer extant, in 1868. Not only was that probably the first opera written by an African-American person, John Thomas Douglas, Virginia's Ball, 3-act, 1868, it could very well have been the very first opera. His mother was a slave. He was born in 1847. He went to Italy to study with Edward Rapoldi. He went to Paris to study, made it back to here to New York. He taught David Manis. We have a very famous music school here. It's called the Manis School of Music. He taught David Manis violin in the 1870s. What an interesting person, John Thomas Douglas. I'm off on a little bit of a tangent because I started talking about the Metropolitan Opera and how they've not performed one, not even Scott Joplin's Treemonisha, 1911, he wrote that. Not any of Harry Lawrence Freeman's 23 operas, the first of which, he was a New York composer also, the first of which, Epithalia, premiered, actually in Denver, I think it premiered in 1891. So the structures have completely pushed BIPOC to the side. It's not important, it's not as good once you show that there were in fact operas written from 1868 up until today. Well, they weren't as good as Wagner, they weren't as good as Mozart, so it's just not as good. Well, how do you know? You haven't heard them. You literally have not heard any of the operas. Well, it's probably not as good. Well, I mean, of course, because that's the history of white supremacy. And that's what we really need to interrogate. So it's a great question. It's something that we need to think about, the addition of these people. We need to have conversations of the composers who were shunted to the side, who were erased from history. But we also need to have more conversations like the ones that I'm trying to instigate. Difficult? Are they difficult? Well, yes, they are. I won't try to sugarcoat that. But at the other side, I've seen some really beautiful things happen. And I'm really, really grateful to people, especially white colleagues and friends, who sit with some discomfort and say, you know what? That wasn't the easiest thing I've ever heard, but by gosh, I can't say this person's wrong, number one. And number two, let me rethink some of my own ideas of genius, of do I really believe that Brahms is just a better composer than Black composer X from the 19th century? Do I? I don't know. And then ask yourself those questions. Thank you for that. That was great.
I have 2 questions left. One, and the last one's much more lighthearted, so we'll end with this well. But one before that comes to us from Justin, and I am going to truncate this one a little bit because I'm having trouble presenting it well. But how can you say that white men need to step aside, in quotes, and not consider that racist? Just because someone is white does not mean they should not do something. As a white man, I find that offensive and racist.
First off, I would say thank you for the question. First off, I would say I didn't say step aside. It was the white male scholar, the young guy who wrote that to me. He said, thank you, I'm going to step aside. And I said, don't go too far. And in fact, it was I who was saying, don't step aside that much. So please don't say that I said to step aside, because I never said that. The fallacy of reverse racism I got into a little bit yesterday, and it's not easy to hear, but I'll go ahead and say it again now. Why is reverse racism a white mythology? Because racism is power. Race is power. The history of the United States, the people who have power have been white people. Again, this is a statement of fact. It's not like in the United States, Black people have had 95% of the power. We Black people have not had 95. The people in power have been historically white people. A fact. They have set up institutions and structures, judicial systems, the electoral college, Senate, you name it, to benefit whiteness. In fact, sometimes this was written very explicitly by white people. So racism cannot be experienced by whites in the same way, which is implicit in what the questioner was asking. In other words, the mythology behind this is that white people have the same experience of racism. Well, if that's the case, it would be all Black people in power, and that's never been the case. I do hasten to add to the questioner that I don't buy into, sometimes people have said only white people can be racist. I say that that's a Black mythology. That's not true, because anybody in the country can be racist, up to and including Philip Ewell right here. That's just a confession of being open and saying, yeah, I'm certainly quite capable, unfortunately, of being racist myself. But in terms of power, white people have had power. I'm stating a fact, and I simply would like everybody to acknowledge the fact that white people have had power, and that has played into the way that our own structures and institutions have evolved in this country. So I'm not saying that, I'm definitely not saying white people should step aside. That was someone else. It was a white man who said that, actually. I'm saying that white people should engage in conversations, as this questioner is, by still being on the call. And I thank this questioner for being here still. I'm sorry I didn't get your name. And I think it's great that you're here and asking this question, because I'm honored that you're here and that you're listening to the answer. I hope you're still there. And is it a difficult topic? Yes, it is. But I think we need to start having adult conversations about exactly what racism is. I would highly recommend reading the works of Ibram Kendi. Difficult though they are, if you go in with an open mind and an open heart, I do think that it can be enlightening, not just for the person who asked that question, but anyone on the call right now. Thank you for that question.
And that takes us to 3:30 or 4:30 in New York.
The only time that matters.
So I would ask you all to please join me in thanking very much Dr. Philip Ewell. Thank you so much for a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. It's given me a great deal to think about. So
thank you all so much for having me today. Thank you for sitting with some discomfort. I know that that's the case, and I really, really appreciate just being here and having difficult conversations. It does really mean a lot to me. It's been an honor to be with you all today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ewell.
Bye-bye.
And thank you everyone for being here. Bye-bye.